Hi there. Today we will talk about another React hook called useContext hook. In our early tutorial, we already covered three hooks: useState hook, useEffect hook, and useReducer hook. So now we will talk about the useContext hook. So again, what is the use or purpose of this useContext hook? Actually, the useContext hook is also used to manage the React state. So then what is the difference between the useState hook and useContext hook? So let's see an example. Suppose I have a component. This is the main component or root component. And if I have one child, for example, the child component name is A. If I have one component inside my root component, then we can easily pass data from child component to parent component, or from parent component to child component. We saw how can we pass data between this parent to child or child to parent in our useState hook component, useState hook example. So this is the scenario where we can use useState hook, no doubt. But what happens if we have one root component, and inside that root component I have a child component, and inside that child component I have another grandchild component? In that case, I have to pass, if I need to data send from this grandchild component to parent component, root component, then we have to pass data from parent component to child component, and from child component to grandchild component. Though we do not need anything with this child component, but to pass the data from parent component to grandchild component, we must have to pass by child component. This is okay when we have one child component or one or two nested child component. But what happens if we have more than two? For example, in this example, if it is a root component, then it has three child component nested inside this app component or root component. For example, if it is a grandparent component, then it will be parent component, and if it is a parent component, then it will be child component, and if child component, then F will be grandchild component. So if we need to pass data from grandparent component to child parent component, then we have to pass data from other components, other child components, because there is no way, because the useState hook or useReducer hook cannot pass data directly from parent component, grandparent component to grandchild component. To solve this problem, React introduced a hook called useContext hook. By this useContext hook, we will create a store or a object inside this root component or main component, and by useState hook, by using useState hook, we can access any component. You can access from any component the store that we created in our app component. That is the reason of the use of useContext hook. Let's see how can we use useContext hook in our action. For this, go to file. At first, I have created two files or two components. First component is the root component, and second component is the child component. So our purpose is to send data, state value or state value from parent component to child component without any argument, so that we can directly access from any component, any child component, from any child component. It doesn't matter how many nested the component are. So to create this component, we have to create a context or a store in our root component. For example, in this case, this component is root component, so I have to create a context store or context API in my root component. For that, I have to create constant or user context is equal to create context, and I also import the create context library, create context function from our React hook. So when we have create context, we must wrap our root component useContext.provider method. Now every component inside this root component will be available to use the useContext hook. So after we wrap our root component with useContext hook, useContext method or useContext provider, I have to pass a store value. Suppose value is equal to user. I have to create a user. So constant user is equal to name, my name, and skills equal to array developer. So now I create a user context and pass this context in our provider. Now when I have wrapped my parent root component, any child component can directly access the state value by useContext hook. So let's go to the user context and useContext hook. I have to give the useContext provider context wrapper here inside my useContext hook. So I have to import this useContext hook in my child component. So for that I have to export this component. So export. If I go to my user, I can have user context, and it will automatically, VS Code automatically import the user context in my top. So I have now user context, and now I have the user state available in my child component. So if I already attach the user here, and if I create null and true, I will see that my object or store value available in my child component without any argument. So it doesn't matter how many times nested our component are. So I have to create the mule store or object in my root component, and by use context hook I can use from any child component. So this problem is solved. Now let's see how can we create multiple context or multiple context. So for that I have to create another context. Here I create one, for example user. If I create another one, product, and I have name, product name is equal to any dummy name, and price is equal to এত ডলার। Now I have to create another provider for this product. For that I have to create this one is the user context. So I have to wrap this user context similar way for product. So I have to create at first I have to create the product context. So constant product context is equal to create context, and now I have to wrap my context product context dot provider, and it must be wrap user because always user comes next after the product. That is the reason we wrap user with product, user provider with product provider. So like again I have to pass the value, and the value will be product. Now we have created nested product or nested context. So how can we access product context here? Again I have to export my product context. So export product context, and now import here product is equal to useContext and product context. When I type this product context, it automatically import in my VS Code, in my top of my user component. So I have the product component available. Now I can copy paste similar code and just replace the user with product. Now I have the product component available. Close this line. We can see that we can access the product component with useContext hook, but we have another way to access the product context, consume the product context or root context store by consumer method. So for that I can use second method. Let's see how can we use this second method. By second method, for example, we try to consume product first. So for that we have to product context then consumer. That means we already import the product context in our top product context. So if I use the consumer method, then we can consume our products store. For that I have to create an function, and inside that function this is the product container, so it must be product argument available in our product component. So return let's say copy this line to here. If I save my file, I can see this is the same value like this one, because we consume the product store or product context by useContext hook, this line, and by second method we can consume product store by product Context.Consume method. So and we can use the if we need to multiple product context, like here I use two product context by useContext hook. It is lot more simpler, but if I need to use the user context hook here, then I have to wrap this HTML code we have to wrap this HTML code with useContext.Consumer and actually no need this one and this one. So now I have user consumer. So in user consumer I can have the user argument same way as we have the product argument. So I user function here. If I copy this line and replace the product with user, now I have product component, product available and user available. So if I save my file, actually I have to wrap I forgot to return something, so I have to return from here. If I nested like here. Now if I save my file, I can see the output appears here. Let's comment out this full line, and if I save my file, I can see my outputs appear here. But if we need to separate object, then I can do that by this way. Copy this line, and this line will be the user production and user product. But if when we use the JSX, and then we have to return single component. So to create this single component, I am using the fragment, React fragment. Now if I save my file, I have the same result as it has here. So I can see that this result and this result has totally identical. Actually here I click pin the user first. So let's if I save my file, it is totally identical. But if you compare the code, you can see if you use the useContext hook, then our code will be much more simpler. But if we try to use the old-fashioned way, that means the functional what is called the higher order component style, that create lot of mess in our text, in our code. That is the reason I always prefer the useContext hook. Or actually when we use the functional component, then React hook is lot more cleaner or easier than the higher order component style. So remove the higher order component style. I will never use this higher order component. I never use the function class component. That is the reason I always use the functional component and use the hook to manage our state. So we learn how can we use the useContext hook and how can we use multiple context in single component. Now until now we only pin our component. That means we cannot modify our state value, because in our root component I have added the plain text or hard-coded code. So if we need to add to modify our state value, we have to use either useState hook or useReducer hook, because we know that by useReducer or useState hook we can manage our state. So we have to use the one of them. So which one is better? We know that when we need the complex or complex state management, then we always prefer use reducer hook. So let's see how can we use state hook first, then we will use the use reducer hook to do the same thing. So how can we do that? For that I have to use constant user set user use state hook, and inside this use state hook I copy this here. Our use state hook is ready. Now create another hook, use state hook for production. So copy this line and replace the user with product and set product, and add the product data inside our product hook and remove these two lines. Now I have two arguments, or I have use state to manage our product. So for that I have to pass our user and product value in our provider. Let's at first provide the product information. Actually move this product information first. It doesn't matter, but for I am using this one. So first one is product, and second argument will be set product. That means the method name. But when we try to pass this method, we have two ways. Either we can pass in object method, or we can pass in function method, array method. This one I always prefer array method, so that our code, actually let's see both method in action. For that now I pass our product and user state value and the method to modify our state. So let's see in our user methods how can we modify our code. So I already configured the user state. So let's now when we pass value like this way, like when we pass product this way, the context hook this time do not return the single user. Instead it will return the for user actually order, change the order so that we can easily remember. In product we use the object method. So in product we have to use product as object, and I have the set product method too, because we pass the product and set product method in our product value, provider value. So I have product and set product method available in my useState hook, useContext hook, and the user we use second method, that means array method. So we have to use array style, array destructuring style user. Now if I already pinned the product and user value, if I save my file, I can see still it's working exactly as before. So let's see how can we modify our code. For example, for that I need to add two buttons so that I can apply a event handler. So button get user on click handle user, handle get user, and let's create the function handle get user, and inside that get user I let's modify the user value. So to modify the user value, set user is equal to user. Actually I have to pass modify as a array, because here I am using an array. Our user is an object. Our user is an object. If I go to my context, I can see our user is an object. So I have to modify user as an object. So I copy the old user state value and modify, add another property, like I have name user name and skill. So add username username is Linux CLI. So if I save my file, I can see I have, if I refresh my page, I can see I have only two. This is not what, this is a product, this is a user. So I have two property, name and skill. If I click this button, I can see my state value is modified. So username is added. So if I try to do for another item for product, so for that I have to create another button or any other, actually get product and handle get product. Let's copy this function and change the function name to product. Now this time we need product, so copy the product value, and in this here I need a little bit summary or description. Something goes not, actually any description. If I save my file, I can see original state. If I click this button, I can see that my product value, actually this is the product, I get same value. That let's actually I do not apply the set product method, so I have to use the set product. Actually when we copy code, this type of error appears a lot. So if I refresh my page, if I click my product, I can see new product updated or added in my state. And if I click this user, I can see my user is updated. That means we can use useState in our useContext hook to manage our state value. So let's see how can we use useReducer hook to manage our state. Do the same thing. So for that I have to replace the useState hook with useReducer hook. We already discussed how to use useContext hook in our earlier tutorial, so I will do not deep dive every step. So I will just create how to use useState hook here. So change useState with useReducer function. So I already import the useReducer in my top. So useReducer hook takes two arguments. First one reducer, and first one is reducer method to manage the state, and second one is the initial value, that means state value. So let's move the object into reducer method. First argument reducer method, second argument initial value, initial state, actually initial state. Create the initial state and pass the value, initial state value, and create the reducer method. Reduce, actually method, not the method, it is a function. Now we know that reducer function has two arguments. First one is the store or state value that comes from this state value, so that will be state, and second one is action, and that value will be comes from this method. So when we use useReducer hook, actually we, instead of set method, we use the dispatch command, dispatch, to indicate that this is a dispatch method. So I have to again pass this method into my function. It doesn't matter what name we use, just use the method name that usually use everywhere or every React community. Dispatch. So I have created my dispatch method, but I do not configure my dispatch option. So for that, need to create switch method, switch condition. So remove switch, and we always check the condition based on the action type. So action.type, and where the action.type type comes from, this action.type will be comes from our this method. So for now, we'll just create type or create our condition. So in switch I have a case success, or actually succeed, return, and I always have to default return state. So here what we want to return, we want to return anything that appears in my dispatch method. So let's first copy our old value, that means state value, and we use an extra property called loading. Loading will be false. That means when we try to request for request, that then our loading property will be true and our loading indicator will be shown in our application, and when our request will be success, we disable loading. That is the reason I use the loading flag. Now copy the state value that will be passed by this method. So here copy action.payload. Again, where the payload will comes, I will apply the action.payload here. So just complete the action type. Now go to the where we put actually we put the into the product context. So let's handle the product context. So not user, product. Actually move this function below so that it do not confuse again and again. So now this time, instead of this function, I have to pass two property of one is type, whose value will be success, and another type whose value will be payload. So I have to go, and here instead of passing this value, I have to pass type is equal to CE the succeed, and payload payload is an object. So this is the value we already defined in my condition or in my switch condition. So if I save my file and refresh the page, if I click the product, actually it throws the error. The reason is that, what is the reason? Let's see the problem first. For that, go to the console log. Set product is not a function. Actually this set product, that means we already renamed this product name with dispatch here. Though when we use the object method, then we need to apply the same name. That is the reason I always prefer the array method. So if I change the object method to, actually let's change the first dispatch method name here. If we use object, then I have to use the same name. So let's convert this to an array first. Now if I save my file, actually I also again change to object to array here too. Now if I save my file, refresh the page, delete the file, production. If I click this product, I can see it working fine. So I configure the product with our useReducer hook, and the user was managed by useState hook. Let's change our useState hook for user. Change our user with useState hook too. So for that I have to change useReducer. So again useReducer need 2 arguments. So this time I cannot enter reducer name, reducer, because this method is this variable name is already assigned here. So instead of reducer, I will put that useReducer. So it indicate useReducer. Then second method is the initial state. So move the second method, user initial state. Let's create these 2 method here. Add 2 argument here. At first constant user initial state, paste the value, and second method, second argument is actually first argument, constant useReducer function. We know that useReducer function will have the same situation. So let's copy the file code from here and paste there. Now this time we also need action and payload. So state and action. Now change the, actually there is nothing to change because this code is almost identical to this one. So if I save my file, we do not need to change here dispatch method, because this time I always I have the array method. So array method do not need to be same name. So if I click this file user, actually refresh the page. If I click this file, actually I do not add any extra method here. So I have to format the same way, add payload and format. So type and payload. So let's copy this line here. First one success, all right. Then second method will be the username. Replace this one with username. Now if I save my file, if I click this button, I can see my output appears. If I click this button, my output appears. So we can how can we use useState or useReducer hook to manage our user context? So again we always follow the standard. So instead of random name, I can use that product dispatch, and again here I will use user dispatch, and again I have to give the same name here, product dispatch, and another one is user dispatch. So and fix the name here too. So it doesn't matter which name we prefer, but again I always prefer the standard. So instead of set product, this will be product dispatch, and this will be the product dispatch, and another is set user, so it will be user dispatch, and again I have to change here too. If I save my file, everything will be okay as it was before. If I refresh my file, I can modify and update our useContext hook. So hopefully after this tutorial you will be able to use the useContext hook as I did. So when we use when we use the useContext hook, if we have a application, React application, a small React application, then we always use useContext hook. But if my application is a medium to large, then we must have to use another state management library like Redux, because when we use useContext hook, we manually have to create every reducer and every function, and we have to invoke or call our reducer function this way. But if we have a little bit knowledge of Redux, then we know that this is the 100% similar as the Redux. So Redux has a library called Redux Toolkit. So by this Redux Toolkit, all the code that we use is already built in with the Redux library. So we do not need to type this extra stuff. We just need to type, instead of this line, actually let's see an example. Instead of this line, we can just type this. Actually remove this line, we can type just this single line, and this single line will handle by this reducer method automatically by Redux Toolkit. So this is a lot more simpler than this one, and it is a simple example, but when we will use real application, then our data will be logged. So in that case, this method will help our code lot more cleaner than creating manually, and manually creating will also introduce a lot of bugs. So if I update our get our production or API data. If I use the real data instead of our mock data, here I use the here we use the value, product value, actually product, where is the product initial value, actually this one. Instead of this data, we can fetch our data from our API. That means I already discussed how can we fetch data from our API using useReducer hook in our earlier tutorial. So I do not go to that example again. So, but you get the idea. If I replace this data with our API data, then our application will be live. So let's see in our next tutorial. Hopefully you understand useContext hook.